Now, Executive Suites with WPRI.com reporter Ted Nesi.
Welcome to Executive Suite. I'm Ted Nesi. We are talking to folks on the cutting edge today of both education and science about what's going on in their fields. Later on, we're going to speak to the CEO of a Providence company that's pioneering some new treatments for cancer, something that's affected probably just about every family and I'm sure everyone watching, so I'm sure we'll all be interested to hear from her. But first, I'm very pleased to be joined by someone new to Rhode Island, but joining a familiar Rhode Island institution, Dr. Noni Thomas López. She's the new head of school at the Gordon School in East Providence. Dr. Thomas López, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
So I want to start off, there'll be people, there's lots of schools,
yes.
and so there'll be people
I'm learning
at home yes, who aren't sure at the Gordon School. Which one's that? Where do they, what do they do? Can you give us just a thumbnail sketch of the Gordon School?
Sure. The Gordon School is a nursery through 8th grade school located in East Providence, Rhode Island on a beautiful campus.
You have a big campus, right?
It's a pretty big campus and lots of outdoor space and lots of space for kids to run around, and we think that's a really important part of what the school is about. But it's a school that was founded really on thinking about independent schools differently, and thinking about independent school spaces as inclusive spaces for children, spaces where children could really be respected and understood for the voices that they bring, even as young as 3 years old, into the classroom. And I think that you'll see in Gordon students from the youngest grades to the oldest students who are very confident in who they are, what they believe in, and what they stand for. And I think that's what makes us one of the more distinctive schools in the area.
So I was going to say, you know, there's Wheeler, there's Moses Brown, there's Bayview, there's a number of independent schools, Providence Country Day, etc. But it sounds like there was always a difference even in how Gordon was founded, right? It was founded in, I think, 1910.
Right. And the thinking behind the founding was founded by a doctor, and the thing that I think is most important to understand about the founding of the school is the real focus on early childhood, and looking at N through 8 as an important developmental stage for young children. It's one of the most turbulent times for young people if you think about middle school, and one of the most formative times if you think about early childhood through elementary. So having those grades together with faculty who understand those developmental changes and shifts, are close observers of children, I think really helps guide students through those important early childhood, elementary, and early adolescent years. So for me, one of the important things about thinking about an N through 8 education, and there's actually lots of research now out there about how students have a real sense of belonging in those spaces. They have a real sense of being known in those spaces, and it's different when you have a lot of high schoolers running around. When middle schoolers can be the leaders of their school, it really sets them up, I think, in important ways when they do go on to upper school.
Because you're done at 8th grade, unlike some other schools where they go right through to high school.
Correct.
So your last job, you were assistant head of school at the Ethical Culture Fieldston School in New York City. What drew you to this job? Why did you decide to come to Rhode Island?
Well, Gordon is the reason I decided to come to Rhode Island. I've been in New York for 20 years, did not see myself leaving anytime soon. But early in my teaching career, Gordon stood out in my mind and memory as one of those schools who was doing important work in the independent school space.
So you already knew about it?
Oh, I definitely knew about it. And teachers that I knew were visiting Gordon because they were one of the schools that were thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion from day one. And I think that's something important to understand about its founding. A lot of schools have come to understand, exclusive schools, elite schools have come to understand the importance of having diverse environments because of the ways that they positively impact learning. But Gordon has had it in its DNA from the beginning. And so when I was thinking about a school that I might want to be a part of, a school community I might want to be a part of, and this opportunity opened up at Gordon, I was clear that I thought a good match was possible.
And it's interesting, you hit right the heart of it, because people hear about this category of schools and they think, oh, that's elite, they're expensive, they're not for the average middle-class family. Maybe a few lower-income folks get to go with scholarships or whatnot. I know Gordon's actually been trying, has sort of a unique program to try to address that. Talk a little about what they've put in place.
So Gordon has established last year the Family Individualized Tuition Program. And just a brief context is that independent schools, there's, I think, a misconception that there are scholarships available for students who can't afford the tuition. But it's really financial aid, and families apply for financial aid in order to, if they feel like they can't afford some pretty high tuitions here in Providence and around the country. So what that can mean is that in a community you have some folks paying 100% or some folks paying 50% of tuition, and that's great for getting at some of the diversity goals of a school. At Gordon, we wanted to think about that differently and not feel like we had different classes of families in our environment. Again, to be true to our roots around creating an inclusive and diverse community. So families, apply to the school. They give us a lot of information about their background, and each family gets their tuition price. So essentially, each family is paying 100% of their tuition. And we think that's an important way to think about being in a community that everyone's contributing, everyone's bringing something to the table. You don't have wealthy families funding the attendance of families who may have more trouble affording that education. And middle-class families are really feeling the pinch in terms of trying to afford an independent school education. Financial aid sometimes goes to the families that need it the most, and then you have your affluent families who can afford it, and we have this phenomenon called barbelling. And we really do want to have a range of families in our community, because we know that is positively impacts learning when you have more different kinds of people learning together and collaborating together.
All right, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk more about the Gordon School with Dr. Noni Thomas López, the head of school. Stick with us on Executive Suite. Welcome back to Executive Suite. I'm Ted Nesi. Later on the show, we're going to talk to the CEO of Medley Genomics about the pioneering stuff they're doing on cancer research here in Providence. But right now, I'm pleased to continue the conversation with Dr. Noni Thomas López. She is head of school at the Gordon School, an independent school in Providence for N through 8th grade. What's the N?
Nursery.
Nursery.
So three-year-olds.
Nursery.
Yes,
I should have come up with that until I don't have children yet. So we were talking before the break about the new approach to tuition you folks have taken with basically a differentiated price tag for every family based on their needs. From the flip side, your job is also to keep the school financially stable and the board.
Yes.
Do you have any concerns that over time, you won't be getting enough on the tuition side because you're trying to bring in a more inclusive socioeconomic group?
I think that every independent school is facing this question. I came from New York, and tuitions at the school that I left are hitting $50,000 a year. So we're not there in Providence, but to think about the range of families that could afford that, even families that believe they're doing well, is small. So I think schools are thinking about what does it mean to have a model that is so tuition based with our changing kind of economic landscape. So schools are looking to figure out what they can do, and I think what Gordon is doing is we're trying to shift the model, and we'll have to wait 3-5 years to see if we're successful, but it's something that's in alignment with our values. And I think that any organization that's doing work that's in aligned with their core values, there are only going to be good things that come out of it. So we'll be learning, tweaks that we need to make, and we want feedback from our community, and I think that's important. But I think we're doing something that a lot of schools just aren't doing. And so I hope that as we're learning more about how this impacts families, how it attracts families to our school, that other schools will continue to think about what are the mechanisms that they need to pull in order to create really authentically inclusive communities.
You've talked yourself about growing up attending private schools, one of the only students of color in your classes, and I know that's a passion of yours, bringing the lessons you learned from that to your work. How has that shaped shaped your approach to being part of leadership and now the leader of an independent school?
So the school that I went to in North Carolina, I was the only black female in my class from 7th grade until I graduated. And then I went back to that school when I graduated from college to teach. So I was there at the school, kind of on the other side of the desk, so to speak, and really was interested in, well, how are decisions made and how do people think about how students, about the student experience. And I wanted to be one of those people who were making those decisions. It's like Hamilton. I wanted to be in the room where it happened. And so very early on, even starting just with a teaching career, I knew very early on that I also wanted to be a leader and have a formal leadership position so that I could influence school culture, particularly in predominantly white independent schools, in a positive way. So everything that I think about, from curriculum to finances to advancement work, really comes through an equity lens, and that's because of my experience, which was positive on so many fronts, but it was isolating in a lot of ways, and there was shame involved from coming from the economic background that I came from. So I want to make sure any school that I'm working in is making sure that no family has to leave pieces of themselves outside of the schoolhouse doors in order to feel like they belong at Gordon.
You've also founded a group called the Inter-School Leadership Institute, which I believe relates to some of these issues. Tell us about that.
So leadership development is a real passion of mine, particularly developing women and people of color in leadership roles. And that doesn't mean formal leadership. It means really developing leadership mindset in whatever context you're working. So thinking about the lack of leadership, particularly at the top levels, head of school levels in independent schools, of women in those positions, of people in color in those positions. I wanted to create a space where we really could work together with educators of color in particular to think about how we develop the social and emotional competencies that I believe are key for transformational leadership. So in some ways, yes, do we talk about career steps and career paths? Yes, but a lot of the work that we do is internal. So thinking about understanding who you are, understanding your EQ, where it's at, how to develop it in important ways, and then how to use that to serve others or serve your school environment. So we spend a week together. It's an incredibly inspiring and moving time for people to be vulnerable. A lot of those educators can't be in their school environments, but they go back in inspired, empowered, and really ready to lead. So it's one of actually my proudest accomplishments is that institute.
Fascinating. Well, there'll be a lot to watch right there. We're out of time for this segment, but thank you, Noni Thomas López, head of school at the Gordon School, for joining me. Stick with us, because coming up next, we're going to talk to Dr. Patrice Milos about Medley Genomics and what they're doing on cancer research. Stick with us on Executive Suite. Welcome back to Executive Suite. I'm Ted Nisi, and for our second half, I'm very pleased to be joined by Dr. Patrice Milos. She is president and CEO, as well as co-founder of Medley Genomics in Providence. And I always say on the show, I was not a good science student myself, but we're going to get it so we all understand it, including the host. And so I'm sure Patrice will help us with that. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Ted, for having me.
So you do some fascinating, complex stuff, but I actually think at a fundamental level, it'll be fairly easy for people to understand. Give us the basics, the basic description of what you're working on.
Sure, and I'll try to keep it as basic as I can during the time. So Medley Genomics is a data analytics company, sort of that new cutting edge of being able to analyze all the data we have from a cancer patient to essentially create a deep fingerprint of the tumor that allows us to see all the different cells of the tumor with the hope of really thinking about lasting cures for patients, something we're challenged with today.
So in layman's terms, we're looking at almost at having, because we talk about this person has brain cancer, they have breast cancer,
yes.
They have, those big categories. You're trying to get much deeper into, yes, you have breast cancer, but this is the exact way yours is versus the next patient who it looks different in?
Exactly. And I sort of reflect on the last 10 years that we've been studying the cancer genome, and really it is the DNA of the tumor which is really unique in each patient. And it's really only been about 10 years since we sequenced the first tumor genome. That means we look at all the ACs and Gs of the tumor of a patient. And what we've learned over the last 10 years is that tumor is very heterogeneous. There are very many different types of cells, different tumor cells, and our goal is to provide the foundational ways to analyze that sequence data to really determine the difference of one patient with non-small cell lung cancer and another patient. And I think it's for us, we saw this most significantly in a study we did in 100 non-small cell lung cancer patients. And it was amazing that those 100 patients, no two were the same.
Like snowflakes.
Exactly. And it points us to a future where cancer therapy may be truly individualized to really help to think about lasting cures for patients.
So you mentioned when I was doing my research for this show, about 1.7 million people were diagnosed with cancer in the U.S.
Yes.
Yeah, just in this country in 2017. And generally, again, I'm not a doctor, but tissue biopsies is usually how we find out if it's cancer, what it is. So you think you can take what you get in the tissue biopsy and analyze it much more fully to get this information that will help with finding a therapy?
Yes. So what we do today typically in cancer is we've now moved to what we call targeted therapy. And that uses the information that's contained in that tissue biopsy to identify the most common pathway that's gone awry in the tumor. And then we treat to adjust that pathway that's gone awry to try to correct that defect or actually result in sort of tumor cell killing. The problem is that that may be fine for 70% of the cells of the tumor, but there's a whole nother layer below that cell type that has different mechanisms that will not be treated by that targeted therapy. And so we need to think of how do we get that very holistic view of all the cells of the tumor, and then think about the different combinations of therapies or even personalized oncology vaccines, which is a whole new area that you'll hear much more about over the coming years to really address the tumor in total.
So we're going to talk more about the research, but I want to talk a little about you and about the company. Sure. Historically, I know from covering it to some extent, the top-level executive suites in life sciences, biotech were often very male-dominated. Yeah. How did you come to be in this position? What was your path to leading this company?
So that's a fascinating question, and it's great following your prior guest. I've always loved science, and I wasn't a good studier, and I knew I wasn't going to be a doctor, but I always loved being in the lab. And so I followed my passion in science and wound up at a company called Pfizer in Groton, Connecticut.
A few of us have heard of that.
Yes. Many years ago, about 20 years ago, and worked in the molecular genetics department and as a bench scientist. And I just, like others, learned to love not just doing science, but also leading others in doing science. And I took on more and more responsibility there and wound up as an executive director. Always grounded in the science, and after I think the third merger, I said I need to go do science somewhere different, and I wound up being a chief scientific officer at a biotech company in Cambridge, where I spent not at that one company but several other companies over the last 10 years, always living in Rhode Island. But I've always worked on sort of the cutting edge of precision therapies and how we could use that more precise information about the genome of the patient to think about improving health care.
So you mentioned it right there, Cambridge. We're always looking enviously in Rhode Island up at Cambridge and Boston and Route 128. How did the company wind up being based here rather than in the hub of life sciences we see up there?
So it's interesting. I was finishing a postdoc at Harvard. At the time, my husband decided to take a job here in Rhode Island. I had never been in Rhode Island. And he said, what would you think about living in Rhode Island? And I said, well, let's go see what it looks like. So we wound up coming down, and he took a position at Save the Bay and had a great career there. But I've never worked in the state. And after my last CEO role, where I was overseeing a pediatric molecular diagnostic company, I like starting things and pushing the edge of innovation. And I said, well, I live in Edgewood. There's a lot going on at Brown. Let's find out what's happening. And it's where I met my co-founder, Dr. Ben Raphael, at the time. And we launched Medley Genomics in October of 2016. And it was the first opportunity I had to say, where do I want to be? Place is important. And I've written a fair amount about this, but it's great to be part of the ecosystem and helping the ecosystem grow here. I was tired of the commute to Cambridge.
I can imagine that. And you mentioned Brown University.
Yes.
But we're always looking at how Brown research can affect the economy here in Rhode Island. This was in partnership with Brown, the company. It was spun out, right?
Yes. So my co-founder had spent the last 10 years at Brown and developed all the computational and data analytics that we now have rolled into Medley Genomics. Importantly, Brown just released a new report this week on the innovation economy and their commitment to really making sure Brown University is not just helping the Brown University students, but the community at large. And it's really important, the state of Rhode Island, to innovate and really drive the engine of economic innovation.
So in May 2018, Medley got a $300,000 federal SBIR grant from the National Cancer Institute. We see that sometimes with smaller companies doing research here in Rhode Island. What does that mean for your company? How significant was it?
Oh my gosh, it's a huge, first of all, validation of what it is we do. The NCI, National Cancer Institute, runs a peer-reviewed program for small businesses. And the threshold for funding these is very high. So it was recognized, the innovative work that we are doing to really advance the future of cancer therapies. So that in itself was great for the company, but it also allowed me to hire my first employees, one which started on Monday in my informatics, who comes from Lexington, Mass. So we're bringing the Massachusetts colleagues here, and it really is a game changer for the company.
So we want to go back to the research you're doing. President Nixon declared war on cancer back in 1971, almost 50 years ago now. How close are we to winning that war, and is that even the right framework in your view, as someone so up close with it, to think about this problem?
So the way I look at it is, we've done a great job with some cancers, and when you think about something like prostate cancer, the way we measure our progress is the 5-year survival rate of patients. And when you looked in, 30 years back, prostate cancer, 68% of men who had prostate cancer would survive 5 years. In 2012, that rate is up to 98%. So we're doing a great job there. But when you look at something like non-small cell lung cancer, patients' survival rate of 5 years is about 19%. So, it impacts every one of us. It impacts our family, our colleagues, our friends. And we mentioned the statistics of 1.7 million newly diagnosed in the US. Well, last year we also lost 600,000 patients to cancer. So it's a disease that we're learning more and more about over the last 10 years. We absolutely will not rest until we really know we can offer lasting cures for patients.
Well, that's a great way to end the conversation. Thank you, Dr. Patrice Milos, President and CEO of Medley Genomics. We'll be keeping an eye on your research and what you're doing there. And thank you for joining us, as always, on Executive Suite. Remember, if you missed any of this episode or any other episode, you can catch all the back episodes on WPRI.com. And you can also catch us on the radio on WPRO Sunday nights at 6:30. We'll see you back here next week on Executive Suite.